Imagine stepping into a mansion where every creak, shadow, and whisper feels alive, and no guest has ever left. What horrifying secret keeps the Holloway family's guests trapped forever, and could you survive where others have failed? The Holloway Manor rose from the mist like a monument to ambition and decay, its weathered stone walls glinting faintly in the early Kentucky morning. Horse-drawn carriages rattled along the gravel drive as the guests arrived, their eyes wide at the sight of the mansion's towering spires and arched windows. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and dying leaves, a fragrance that seemed to cling to the skin and linger long after a deep breath. Caroline Myers, the first to step from her carriage, paused to take in the house's foreboding presence. She had been told stories of the Holloways, of their impeccable manners, their wealth, and most unsettlingly, of their reputation. No guest had ever stayed more than a week without leaving abruptly, or never leaving at all. Sorry to interrupt, but I gotta ask, where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. Her mother had waved off her hesitation with a laugh, speaking of the family as if they were mere socialites, eccentric but harmless. Yet Caroline's instincts pricked, a quiet warning echoing in the pit of her stomach. As she ascended the stone steps, the doors opened before she could knock, revealing the Holloways themselves. The patriarch, Elias Holloway, stood with the poise of a man accustomed to power, his dark eyes glinting beneath a furrowed brow. His wife, Beatrice, followed closely behind, her skirts rustling with each step, a smile painted carefully across her face. The children lingered in the shadows, faces pale and still, their expressions eerily composed. "Welcome, Miss Myers," Elias intoned, his voice smooth, measured, commanding attention without effort. "We are delighted you could join us." Caroline's pulse quickened despite herself. There was something in his gaze, something that lingered too long on the corners of her eyes, as if he were already mapping her presence. The other guests arrived one by one, each introduced with careful formality, each received with the same unsettling courtesy. Whispered remarks and forced laughter filled the air. But beneath it, the mansion hummed with a quiet menace. Every footstep on the polished floors, every rustle of fabric seemed amplified, as though the house itself were listening. Once inside, the foyer revealed itself to be a cavern of polished wood and shadow. Chandeliers, grand and crystal, hung like frozen constellations from the high ceiling, reflecting a dim, filtered light. The walls were lined with portraits of Holloway ancestors, their eyes dark and accusing, as though following the movements of those daring enough to enter their domain. Caroline felt a shiver pass through her. She told herself it was the chill of the morning, but a deeper instinct whispered that the house was already assessing her, marking her in subtle ways. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Beatrice said, her smile widening just enough to unsettle. "Dinner will be served shortly, and we have prepared a night you will not soon forget." Her tone was sweet, yet every syllable carried an undercurrent of warning, subtle and unyielding. The guests moved through the mansion, each step revealing more of its chilling grandeur. Long corridors stretched into darkness, their ends obscured by shadow. The carpets, thick and plush, swallowed footsteps but amplified unease. Doors creaked with the slightest pressure, and Caroline realized quickly that every sound, every movement, was observed, even in silence. She could feel the mansion's pulse, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed almost alive, and she wondered how many secrets it had already collected and who, or what, had vanished within its walls. By the time the first candle was lit in the grand dining hall, Caroline sensed that the Holloway Manor had already claimed her attention. She didn't yet know it would claim much more than that. The dining hall stretched before the guests like a cathedral of excess, its ceiling vaulted high, wooden beams carved with intricate patterns that resembled twisting vines. Candles flickered in wrought iron sconces along the walls, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed almost to reach for the diners as they took their seats. The air smelled faintly of roasted meats, sweetened sauces, and a subtle undertone of something metallic, almost imperceptible, like blood warmed by sunlight. Caroline took a seat near the center, close enough to see the expressions of the other guests, but far enough from the Holloways to observe their peculiar habits. Elias Holloway presided at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The flicker of candlelight caught in his eyes, revealing just a hint of sharp calculation beneath the mask of genteel hospitality. Beatrice, seated beside him, maintained a calm, graceful demeanor. But Caroline noticed the tight set of her jaw and the way her fingers tapped lightly against the polished mahogany surface. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture precise. The first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of smoked fish and finely cut vegetables, plated with meticulous care. The guests ate politely, their silverware clinking softly against porcelain plates, but the conversation was strained, superficial at best. Caroline tried to engage the person beside her, a man named Mr. Whitmore, a young lawyer from Louisville, but his replies were clipped, his eyes darting nervously toward the Holloways at frequent intervals. It was as if even the most mundane words had to pass through an invisible gatekeeper before being spoken aloud. Elias spoke rarely, his words measured, carefully chosen. Each sentence seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary, weighted with meaning beyond what was immediately apparent. "We hope your journey here was comfortable," he said at one point, his voice smooth, carrying a note that was almost imperceptibly sinister. Caroline felt her pulse quicken, sensing a subtle undercurrent in his hospitality, a hidden rule she was not yet aware of. Beatrice, meanwhile, directed the conversation toward pleasantries, asking the guests about their travels and families, her tone syrupy sweet yet almost teasingly sharp. Caroline caught the way her eyes would flick toward certain guests, a lingering glance that seemed to probe, as if measuring not just their appearances, but the depths of their resolve. As the meal progressed, Caroline noticed the other guests shifting subtly in their seats, the laughter too hollow, the smiles too carefully measured. The room felt alive, aware, almost breathing, each gust of wind from the open windows sending a faint chill along the diner's spines. The Holloway's mansion was not merely a place to host. It was a trap, constructed with elegance and danger, designed to enthrall and ensnare. By the time the main course arrived, the conversation had all but ceased, replaced by a tense silence that seemed to tighten with each passing minute. Caroline found herself studying the portraits lining the walls again, their eyes dark, unyielding, and impossibly alive. She wondered how many of the mansion's secrets they had witnessed over the decades, and whether they, too, were complicit in whatever horrors lingered in the shadows. The final course arrived, a decadent display of fruits, pastries, and confections, but it was the Holloways themselves who drew Caroline's attention. Elias's calm control, Beatrice's poised watchfulness, the children's stillness, they were all part of a delicate choreography, a ritual she had yet to understand fully. The manor was not just a home, it was a stage, and she, along with the other guests, had unknowingly stepped onto it. As the candles burned lower and shadows lengthened, Caroline felt a growing sense of unease. Every glance, every sound, every subtle movement of the Holloways hinted at a story beneath the surface, one that had claimed countless others before her. And though no one spoke openly of danger, Caroline sensed it all around her. The mansion itself seemed to whisper warnings she could not ignore. By the end of the evening, as the guests were shown to their rooms, Caroline understood that she was not merely visiting the Holloway mansion. She had entered a world in which charm and civility masked something far more sinister, and the first threads of dread wound tightly around her heart. She did not yet know the full extent of the Holloway's power, but already she could feel that leaving alive was no longer a simple certainty. The corridors of the Holloway mansion were labyrinthine, each hallway twisting and turning with such precision that even someone with a sense of direction as sharp as Caroline's could easily become disoriented. The walls were lined with deep, dark wood paneling, polished to a high gloss that reflected the flickering candlelight like liquid amber. Portraits hung at uneven intervals, some faces so lifelike they seemed to breathe, their eyes following her with quiet intensity as she moved from room to room. The air was cool, carrying a faint scent of wax, old paper, and something else Caroline couldn't place, an undercurrent of decay, like secrets fermenting in the shadows. Caroline's room was on the second floor, a chamber that appeared at first to be lavish but quickly revealed a careful precision that felt almost clinical. The bed was draped in heavy velvet, perfectly arranged, while a single chair stood in the corner as though waiting for someone to sit and observe. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass slightly tinted, muting the world outside. She placed her small bag on the bed and took a tentative step toward the window, only to notice that the garden below, illuminated by lanterns, was strangely silent. No wind stirred the branches, no animal dared to move. The silence was deliberate, oppressive. A soft knock on the door startled her. Caroline spun, expecting a maid or servant, but it was Beatrice, who entered without waiting for permission. She carried a small tray with a glass of water and a piece of fruit. Her movements were fluid, graceful, yet there was a precision to them that unnerved Caroline. "You must be tired from your journey," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as silk but layered with something unspoken. She set the tray on the desk and observed Caroline carefully, her gaze lingering longer than politeness demanded. "Dinner can be exhausting, especially in a house such as ours." Caroline nodded, unsure of how to respond. Beatrice's presence felt like a test, a silent challenge. She realized quickly that every movement in the Holloway mansion was watched, measured, and catalogued. Nothing happened by accident. "May I ask something?" Caroline ventured, keeping her tone casual despite the knot forming in her stomach. "How long have you lived here?" Beatrice's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Longer than most guests, and certainly longer than any who have left. Time has a different weight within these walls." Her words were calm, almost serene, but Caroline sensed an edge beneath them, a quiet warning. Before Caroline could respond, a faint sound echoed from the hallway. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps following an unseen pattern. Beatrice paused, tilting her head as though listening for something just beyond perception. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the thick silence in its place. "That's nothing for you to concern yourself with," Beatrice said lightly, her voice carrying a subtle command that brooked no argument. "Rest and allow the house to settle. It is particular about its guests." Caroline sat on the edge of the bed, the fruit untouched, and tried to steady her racing thoughts. The mansion itself seemed to hum with quiet energy, as though the walls were alive, attuned to her movements and thoughts. She recalled the expressions at the dining table, the meticulous way the Holloways observed each guest. Every glance, every word, every smile carried weight. Later, as Caroline explored the room further, she noticed small details that felt out of place. A loose floorboard near the wardrobe, a shadow in the corner that didn't align with the candlelight, and the faintest whisper of a draft that suggested hidden passages. The realization settled in. This mansion was not merely large. It was designed to control, to confuse, to manipulate. Guests didn't simply walk its halls. They were guided, sometimes toward danger, sometimes toward revelation, all at the discretion of its owners. By the time night fully descended, Caroline felt a deep unease pressing against her chest. She knew that the Holloways watched, that their mansion had claimed many before her, and that her instincts, the sharp awareness she had honed through years of observation, were now her most critical tool. She resolved to pay attention, to note every shadow, every sound, every irregularity. The mansion was patient. Caroline realized she would need to be even more so. To survive, she would have to learn its rhythms, its hidden doors, and its quiet cruelty. The Holloway family was more than wealthy, more than refined. They were predators, and their house was the trap. Tonight, Caroline would sleep, but her mind would remain alert, preparing for the trial of understanding the mansion that had never let a guest leave alive. The morning sunlight spilled hesitantly through the tall windows of Caroline's room, muted by the heavy curtains that seemed intent on holding the mansion in a perpetual twilight. Even at dawn, the Holloway house resisted the warmth of the world outside, as if it were a creature that thrived in shadows. Caroline rose slowly, her feet brushing the cool wooden floor. Each step carried a sound that seemed unnaturally loud, echoing through the hallway like a warning to someone or something listening. She had already begun to notice patterns, subtle movements and habits of the staff and family that others might have dismissed as ordinary, but she understood they were carefully choreographed. Beatrice appeared without knock, as if she had materialized from the walls themselves, holding a tray with a steaming cup of tea. Her movements were elegant, almost ritualistic. Caroline could feel her gaze even before it touched her face, assessing, weighing, cataloging. "You slept well, I hope?" Beatrice asked, setting the tray down and retreating a step. Her voice was soft yet imbued with authority. "The mansion has a way of ensuring its guests are prepared." Caroline sipped the tea, noting the faintly metallic taste that lingered on her tongue. It was subtle, unnoticeable to anyone less alert, but enough to stir a sense of caution. She kept her eyes on Beatrice, watching for signs of duplicity, movement, or distraction. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the room, the hallway, even the air itself, carried tension, like the strings of a finely tuned instrument ready to snap. After breakfast, Caroline wandered the halls. The mansion was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Every surface gleamed as though polished by invisible hands, and every corner hid shadows that seemed to shift when unobserved. She realized that the layout was deliberately confounding. Rooms looped back on themselves, doors led to hallways that didn't match the architecture, and staircases appeared where none should exist. It was a deliberate maze, one that had ensnared every guest before her. In the library, shelves of ancient tomes reached the ceiling, their spines faded with age. Caroline ran her fingers along the books, listening for the hollow sounds that suggested hidden compartments. She found one, a panel in the back of a shelf that swung open silently to reveal a narrow passage. It was dust-free, unnaturally clean. Whoever had constructed it wanted it to be used, to channel movement without detection. Footsteps echoed behind her, deliberate and controlled. Caroline froze, heart quickening, and turned to find Lucius Holloway standing in the doorway. He was a tall man, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce beyond the physical. He didn't smile. Instead, he simply observed her, as if measuring whether she understood the mansion as well as he did. "You've noticed," he said softly, voice low and resonant. "Most guests never even feel the walls watching. You feel them." Caroline met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "This house isn't ordinary. I know it." Lucius tilted his head, a gesture that was both approving and unsettling. "Good. Awareness is survival. That said, knowing the walls exist is not enough. One must understand what they want." Caroline's mind raced. She understood immediately. The mansion was more than a structure. It was a predator, one that required attention, intelligence, and patience to navigate. Guests were not merely trapped, they were studied, tested, and ultimately consumed by the Holloways' design. Every detail, from the polish on the banisters to the placement of candle sconces, was deliberate, calculated to control perception, rhythm, and reaction. As Lucius stepped back and left, Caroline felt a shift in the air. It was the first warning. The house was responding to her, acknowledging her presence as a variable it could not yet predict. She realized she would need to move carefully, map every room, and anticipate every shadow. To survive, she would need to play the mansion's game, a game whose rules were cruel and ever-changing. Later that afternoon, she discovered another oddity, a dining room that led to a hidden stairway descending into darkness. Caroline hesitated, then decided to follow it, knowing instinctively that the house was offering a path, an invitation or a trap. She could not tell which. The stairs were narrow and steep, echoing with each step, and the air grew colder, damper, filled with the scent of stone and something older, something almost alive. At the bottom, she found a subterranean chamber lined with alcoves. In each alcove were remnants of previous guests, personal belongings, jewelry, letters, and sketches, left as if the mansion had collected them itself. Caroline's stomach turned. This was no ordinary house. It was a vessel for obsession, preservation, and control. Each item represented a person, and each person had vanished into its walls. A sudden noise, a low, deliberate creak from above, reminded her that she was not alone. Caroline pressed herself against the stone wall, listening, calculating. Every instinct screamed that the mansion had noticed her. She was a new variable, a presence it would attempt to dominate, manipulate, or consume. And she, in turn, understood that to survive she could not merely move. She would have to fight, think, and outlast it. The Holloway mansion, with all its grandeur and malevolence, had never encountered a guest like Caroline, and she intended to ensure it would not succeed. The mansion seemed to pulse with life as Caroline ascended from the subterranean chamber, each step heavier than the last. It was as though the walls themselves were aware she had seen too much, registering her intrusion into their secrets. She paused at the top of the narrow stairway, her hand pressed against the cold, polished railing, listening. Silence stretched around her, yet it felt charged, expectant, like the calm before a storm. Somewhere within the house, the Holloway family moved with the grace and precision of predators, their presence almost tangible even when invisible. Caroline returned to the main hallway, noting once again the way the mansion manipulated her perception. Doors that had led to the same hallway before now opened onto entirely different spaces. The mansion seemed to shift subtly when unobserved, guiding her path, testing her attentiveness. She realized that even movement within the house could be a trap if one was careless. Every choice, every turn, step, or glance was recorded, analyzed, and potentially used against her. Her next encounter was not long in coming. She was examining a portrait in the Grand Gallery, a painting of an imposing man with hollow eyes that seemed to follow her every motion, when a shadow fell across the floor. She turned, and there he was, Henry Holloway, the eldest son, tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating an aura of both charm and menace. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and his smile carried a weight of foreknowledge. "Curious," he said, voice smooth yet laced with something colder beneath. "Not many guests wander so freely, or so boldly." Caroline straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "This house isn't ordinary," she replied, her tone steady. "I can feel it." Henry's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, so you know then. Good. Awareness is the first test. Most fail without ever realizing one exists." He moved closer, walking with the fluid grace of a predator unconcerned with warning signs. Caroline could see his hands were perfectly composed, each gesture deliberate, almost ceremonial. There was a menace in his calm, a hidden violence beneath the poise. She felt the mansion respond to him, as if he were its favored child, and the walls themselves seemed to lean toward his presence. "Do you understand why the Holloways are different?" Henry asked, tilting his head slightly. "This mansion is more than a home. It is a crucible, a proving ground. Every guest who comes here is evaluated, absorbed, and occasionally preserved." Caroline's stomach tightened. The subtle threat was clear. She was being tested, watched, measured. The mansion was not merely alive in a supernatural sense. It had become a conduit for the family's design, a tool for their obsession with control and immortality. Every corridor, staircase, and hidden chamber existed to enforce their will and feed their curiosity. "Preserved?" Caroline repeated, steadying her voice. "You mean people never leave?" Henry's expression hardened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Some leave in spirit, some in name, but the mansion, it keeps them, keeps a part of them. Every guest becomes a story the walls memorize." He turned, gesturing to the gallery. "Look around. Every portrait, every artifact, every hidden passage, all of it is part of the Holloway memory. The house does not forget, and neither do we." Caroline's eyes swept over the room, noticing more than before. Subtle marks on the floorboards, faint scuff patterns along the walls, and the way the candlelight seemed to linger unnaturally long in certain corners. She realized she was walking a map that had been drawn long before her arrival, one the family understood fully. Before she could respond, a quiet voice called from the far end of the gallery. "Henry?" Caroline turned to see Eleanor Holloway, the youngest daughter, stepping into view. She was a fragile-looking girl, almost ethereal, yet her eyes were piercing, observing Caroline with a sharpness that contrasted with her delicate frame. "You must meet her properly," Henry said, bowing slightly. "Eleanor has a way of understanding the subtler aspects of our guests. You may find her insights enlightening." Eleanor approached with a quiet grace, her steps almost soundless. "The mansion, it reacts to those who feel it," she said softly. "It tests, it whispers, it watches. You are not invisible, Caroline. That much is clear." Caroline nodded slowly, realizing that the family, in their own way, were extensions of the house. The Holloways were not merely inhabitants. They were conduits, vessels, orchestrating the mansion's labyrinthine horrors with precision. She understood now that any attempt to leave without understanding would be fatal. To survive, she would need to learn the mansion's rules, the family's habits, and the delicate balance that allowed them to thrive. The sun had dipped lower, and shadows stretched like fingers across the gallery floor. Caroline felt the mansion's pulse beneath her feet, the subtle thrum of awareness. The Holloway family had revealed themselves, and in doing so had raised the stakes. Escape was no longer a distant hope. It was a challenge, one that required intelligence, courage, and an almost supernatural patience. As evening approached, Caroline made her way to a side corridor, determined to map the mansion's interior and understand its mechanisms. Every step reminded her that she was no longer merely a guest. She was part of the mansion's experiment, and the family, its watchful stewards, were keenly observing her every move. The mansion had shifted while Caroline slept, though she could not have said exactly how. She awoke to the faint smell of smoke, mingled with the lingering scent of polished wood and candle wax. At first, she assumed it was a dream, the way shadows danced across the walls, elongating and shrinking unnaturally. But when she moved toward the hallway, the subtle chill confirmed her suspicion. The mansion was awake and aware, testing her perception once again. The corridor stretched before her in ways she did not remember. Doors appeared where none had been, archways led to unfamiliar rooms, and the faint echo of footsteps behind her set her heart racing. Caroline tried to remain calm, telling herself that observing, noting, and staying attentive were her only defenses. Yet the deeper she ventured, the more she felt the mansion breathing around her, inhaling her uncertainty and exhaling subtle threats. Her first encounter of the day came in the library, a room so vast it seemed to consume light. Bookshelves towered from floor to ceiling, some so ancient their spines threatened to crumble under their own weight. Caroline ran her fingers along the shelves, aware that this room held more than just literature. The mansion had stored its memories here, and she could sense echoes of past guests, captured in whispered phrases and faint impressions of movement among the books. "You're awake," a voice said from behind. Caroline spun around to see Eleanor Holloway standing quietly in the shadows, her expression neutral but unnervingly attentive. "The house tests you while you sleep," Eleanor explained, her voice almost melodic yet carrying an edge that suggested warning. "Every moment, it watches your reactions, catalogs your fears, and learns how to manipulate you." Caroline swallowed hard. "And it does this to everyone?" Eleanor shook her head. "Some never notice. Some realize too late. The mansion has its favorites, and its others, it shapes them in its own image." She stepped closer, and Caroline noticed the faintest shimmer of movement in Eleanor's eyes, as though she were peering not just at Caroline, but through her, into the space where her mind tried to hide. "Your survival depends on understanding its rules. Observe, remember, and anticipate, but do not expect mercy if you fail." Before Caroline could reply, a sudden noise reverberated through the library, a loud crash followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the source. A window had blown open, revealing the overgrown garden outside, where twisted vines clutched the walls as if the house itself had grown roots to trap intruders. Yet the air remained still, and no wind moved the leaves. From the shadows of the library, Henry appeared, his presence commanding as ever. He moved toward her with deliberate, unnerving calm. "The mansion doesn't merely observe," he said, voice low and deliberate. "It tests your instincts, provokes fear, and measures your responses. Every creak of the floor, every shifting shadow is a puzzle, and every choice you make writes your fate." Caroline felt the tension coiling in her chest, a physical weight she could not ignore. She had assumed the mansion's dangers were subtle, its horrors merely psychological. Now she understood that the house orchestrated its trials with precise intent, manipulating space and perception to see how far she could be pushed. Henry's gaze swept over her, and Caroline caught a flicker of something darker in his expression. "Do you know why no guest ever leaves?" he asked, almost rhetorically. "It is because they fail to see what the mansion wants them to see. They resist, panic, or wander blindly, and the house does not forgive mistakes." As if on cue, the floor beneath them groaned, and a hidden stairwell revealed itself in the far corner of the library. Caroline's instincts screamed that it led to a place few were meant to find. Henry gestured toward it, his smile unreadable. Curiosity is a dangerous ally, but sometimes it is the only key to survival. If you choose to explore, be careful. The mansion rewards cunning and punishes recklessness. Eleanor stepped forward, placing a delicate hand on Caroline's arm. You will need more than courage to survive here, she warned. The mansion manipulates more than your senses. It manipulates your thoughts, your memories, and your fears. One wrong step, and it will trap you forever. Caroline hesitated, but the sense of inevitability pushed her forward. She descended the hidden stairwell, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The air grew colder, heavier, and she felt the walls pressing inward, almost sentient in their scrutiny. The mansion had begun its direct manipulation, and Caroline was its willing participant, or perhaps its next victim. As she stepped into the shadowed depths below, Caroline realized she was no longer a guest in a house. She was a piece of its labyrinthine game, where every choice mattered and every misstep could be fatal. The mansion's pulse thrummed beneath her feet, and the Holloway family's unseen eyes watched, calculating, ensuring that she understood one undeniable truth. Survival would demand more than bravery. It would demand adaptation, cunning, and a complete surrender to the mansion's dark logic. The deeper Caroline descended into the mansion's hidden underbelly, the more distorted her sense of time and space became. The stairwell seemed endless, though her legs ached as though she had been walking for hours. Each step echoed unnaturally, sometimes in rhythm with her heartbeat, sometimes out of sync, creating the impression that the house itself was mocking her awareness of reality. By the time she reached the bottom, a dense fog had settled around her, obscuring both walls and floor. The mansion had decided she needed a trial, a test of perception and nerve. Before her appeared a vast chamber, dimly illuminated by sconces that flickered as if alive. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone and something more sinister, faint and metallic, like blood. Caroline's instincts screamed that this room was a trap, yet curiosity compelled her to move forward. Her hand brushed against the cold wall, and the surface rippled under her touch, like water frozen in a distorted mirror. She recoiled, heart racing, realizing that even the mansion's walls were designed to unsettle. A voice echoed across the chamber, layered and impossible to locate. "Fear is the currency here," it whispered, simultaneously soft and commanding. Caroline spun in a circle, trying to locate the source, but the shadows seemed to cling to her, bending light and obscuring any clear direction. "Only those who understand themselves can navigate the Holloway labyrinth," the voice continued, "and even then, few succeed." Suddenly, the fog coalesced into shapes, figures of past guests, frozen mid-action, eyes wide in silent screams, their faces twisted in terror, their bodies suspended as though caught in the mansion's cruel choreography. Caroline recognized the horror in their expressions. It mirrored what she felt inside, the creeping panic and self-doubt the mansion had been feeding for days. She wanted to look away, to turn back, but an unseen force pressed her forward. A faint whisper reached her ears. "Every choice matters. Hesitate, and you join them." Caroline's throat went dry. She tried to remember everything Eleanor and Henry had warned her. Observe, anticipate, adapt. The mansion was testing her, but it was not only the environment. It was probing her mind, forcing her to confront her deepest fears. At the center of the chamber, she found a table. On it lay objects that seemed innocuous at first glance: a candle, a pocket watch, a small brass key. Caroline felt drawn to them, though something in her gut urged caution. She reached for the pocket watch. The moment her fingers touched its cold surface, the room shuddered. The fog thickened, the figures moved, and suddenly the chamber was alive with sound. Footsteps, whispers, and low moans that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The mansion's manipulations became more overt. The walls stretched and contracted subtly, corridors forming and vanishing at will. The floor shifted beneath her weight, and the faintest tremors ran through the stone. Caroline realized the mansion was watching her reactions to every stimulus, learning her thresholds, her panic triggers. Each heartbeat was catalogued, each hesitation noted. The mansion did not merely house its guests, it studied them, adapted, and punished inefficiency. Then she heard it. A soft, deliberate laughter. It was human, yet not entirely so, echoing and overlapping itself, as if the mansion had borrowed someone's voice from the past and twisted it into a weapon. Caroline's instincts screamed danger, but she remembered Eleanor's words. Survival required adaptation, not brute force. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus, pushing aside the fear and noise, observing patterns in the mansion's manipulations. Her eyes fell on the brass key. Though the fog obscured the details of the room, she noticed that each figure frozen in terror had once held an object similar to what lay before her. A realization struck. The mansion did not merely trap its guests, it offered choices, each a test of courage, intelligence, and instinct. Failure to act decisively meant joining the frozen phantoms, trapped in permanent fear. Caroline reached for the key again, steadying her mind. The mansion's response was immediate. The fog swirled violently, and the shadows writhed as if attempting to snatch the key from her grasp. She clenched it tightly, feeling a small sense of victory, though fleeting. The chamber seemed to acknowledge her decision, settling into a tense silence. She understood that this was only the first of many trials, each more dangerous, each more psychological. The mansion's real weapon was its ability to manipulate perception and force guests to confront themselves under extreme duress. With the key in hand, Caroline realized that the path ahead was no longer about finding exits or avoiding danger. It was about understanding the mansion's logic, predicting its manipulations, and confronting her own fears without faltering. Every choice mattered now. Every hesitation could cost her life. And deep within her, a spark of determination ignited. Survival was not guaranteed, but she would not succumb without a fight. The key burned in Caroline's palm as she made her way through the shifting corridors. Every step seemed to echo with hidden footsteps, though she knew she was alone, or at least alone in the physical sense. The mansion had a way of warping reality. Rooms could stretch into endless halls or collapse into claustrophobic alcoves without warning. It was disorienting, but Caroline had learned to observe, to note the mansion's subtle cues. The flicker of light along a wall, the whisper of air that suggested a hidden passage, the faint metallic scent that warned of danger nearby. The brass key seemed to pulse as she moved, almost guiding her. It was small, unassuming, but Caroline had no doubt that it was important, possibly a tool to unlock one of the mansion's many secrets. Yet, as she approached a massive oak door at the end of a hall, she hesitated. The door was etched with symbols that were unfamiliar yet felt vaguely threatening, a language of the mansion itself. Her instincts screamed that something deadly waited on the other side. A sudden sound made her spin, a sharp metallic clink followed by a soft dragging noise. The fog in the corridor thickened, curling around her ankles like living smoke. Caroline's heart pounded as the sound grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. Something, or someone, was approaching. She backed up, pressing herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Then it appeared. A figure, shrouded in tattered black robes, moved with unnerving precision. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Caroline felt the weight of its gaze. The figure carried a long, curved blade that glinted faintly in the dim light. It moved without hesitation, each step measured, almost ceremonial. Caroline realized immediately. This was one of the mansion's guardians, a being that existed solely to hunt and eliminate intruders. The previous guests she had seen in the fog, the frozen phantoms, had most likely met this very fate. Adrenaline surged. Caroline knew she could not fight it directly. The guardian was too fast, too precise, too lethal. But she had the key. She clutched it and darted toward a narrow passage she had noticed just moments ago, the one where the fog was thinnest. The guardian reacted instantly, spinning to intercept her. Its blade arced in a deadly sweep, slicing the air where she had been standing. The sound of steel against nothingness made her stomach drop. Caroline ducked into the narrow passage, barely squeezing through as the guardian's blade scraped the wall behind her. The corridor twisted unnaturally, turning sharply, forcing her to navigate blind corners and unseen steps. She felt her lungs burning, her legs trembling, but the fear sharpened her senses. Every breath, every heartbeat was a measure of survival. The passage opened into a small chamber, lit by a single flickering chandelier. The floor was littered with broken mirrors, each reflecting distorted versions of herself. For a moment, she paused, realizing the mansion was trying to disorient her further. She took a deep breath, recalling Eleanor's warnings. The mansion thrived on hesitation, on panic, on allowing fear to dictate movement. Then she heard it again, the soft, deliberate footsteps of the guardian. It had followed her, persistent and patient. Caroline scanned the room and noticed a trapdoor partially concealed beneath a rug. She could hear the guardian approaching, its presence growing heavier, more oppressive. There was no time to hesitate. With trembling hands, she lifted the trapdoor and descended into the darkness below. The ladder led to a subterranean tunnel, damp and narrow, with walls slick from moisture. The faint light of the chandelier above disappeared, leaving her in near total darkness. But she moved forward, trusting the key, trusting her instincts. Behind her, the guardian paused at the trapdoor, its blade raised, but it could not follow. The mansion had rules, and even its guardians could not violate certain boundaries. As Caroline progressed through the tunnel, she realized the mansion's true danger was not just the guardians or the physical traps, but the psychological torment, the fear, the uncertainty, the constant manipulation. Every shadow could conceal death, every step could lead to a trap. And yet, as terrifying as it was, she felt something else, a growing confidence. She had survived the first direct encounter. She had outmaneuvered one of the mansion's lethal agents, and that knowledge, fragile and fleeting, became a weapon in itself. Emerging from the tunnel, Caroline found herself in a vast, dimly lit hall, far from the corridors above. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and something unidentifiably metallic. She tightened her grip on the key and moved cautiously, aware that the mansion's trials were only beginning. The guardians were not the end. They were merely a reminder that this mansion demanded more than courage. It demanded cunning, observation, and the will to endure horrors beyond imagination. And somewhere deep within the mansion, the soft echo of laughter followed her, promising more trials, more tests, and more deadly encounters. Caroline understood that leaving this place alive would require more than just luck. It would require mastering the mansion itself. Caroline emerged into a hall that seemed impossibly vast, its ceilings lost in shadow. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and something else, an underlying scent she couldn't immediately place, metallic and almost sweet. The mansion had a way of warping reality, making space both endless and claustrophobic at the same time, and this hall felt like a labyrinth in its own right. As she took cautious steps forward, her eyes adjusted to the dim glow emanating from wall sconces, and she noticed that the walls were lined with portraits. But these were no ordinary portraits. They seemed alive in a subtle way, their eyes following her, their expressions shifting ever so slightly as she moved. Her attention was drawn to a series of journals resting on a small, ornate table in the center of the hall. They were dusty, some with pages yellowed and brittle, others surprisingly intact, as though the mansion itself had preserved them deliberately. Caroline's fingers trembled as she opened the first journal. The handwriting was uneven, often jagged, as if written in haste or fear. The entries were from previous guests, some who had vanished without a trace, others who had met grisly fates at the hands of the mansion itself. Reading their words, Caroline could feel their terror as if it had seeped into the pages. The mansion did not just kill, it consumed memories, twisted perceptions, and left traces of its horrors behind. One journal detailed a hidden room behind a massive fireplace in the west wing. Another spoke of a cryptic symbol that, when pressed in a certain sequence, revealed a concealed stairwell descending into darkness. Caroline realized that the mansion was not merely a haunted structure but a puzzle, a living entity that demanded understanding and respect. Each previous guest had left clues, unintentional breadcrumbs that might now serve as her lifeline. The sound of soft footsteps echoed behind her, and Caroline's heart leapt. She spun around, but the hall was empty. The mansion had a way of playing tricks on the mind, and she reminded herself that fear could be just as lethal as the guardians themselves. Pressing on, she studied the journals carefully, piecing together patterns and warnings. One recurring theme stood out: the importance of observation. Those who had failed to notice the subtle cues, the smell of damp stone, the flicker of candlelight, the uneven floorboards had not survived. The mansion rewarded the attentive and punished the reckless. As she explored further, Caroline found a faded map tucked inside one of the journals. It depicted the mansion in astonishing detail, far beyond what she had seen above ground. Hidden corridors, secret chambers, and subterranean tunnels stretched across the pages, some marked with cryptic symbols she did not yet understand. The key she carried seemed to correspond to one of these marks, a small, intricately drawn lock symbol in the map's lower right corner. Her pulse quickened. The key was clearly part of a larger mechanism, something that previous guests had failed to activate. The mansion, she realized, was testing her. Every trap, every guardian, every shifting corridor was a challenge designed to measure her resolve. The journals provided guidance but no guarantees. Each clue carried risk. Misinterpretation could be fatal. And yet, Caroline felt a spark of determination. Unlike those who had perished, she was alert, adaptable, and increasingly unafraid. Fear remained. But now it served as fuel, rather than paralyzing her. A sudden cold draft swept through the hall, extinguishing the sconces one by one, leaving Caroline in near-complete darkness. Her breathing grew shallow, her senses sharpening instinctively. She followed the faint outline of the map in her mind, navigating toward a section marked with the lock symbol. The walls seemed to constrict around her as she moved, the mansion subtly resisting her progress, testing her focus. Each step was deliberate, each pause calculated. Finally, she arrived at a portion of the wall that matched the map's symbol. It was unremarkable at first glance, a panel of polished mahogany with no visible handle or keyhole. Caroline knelt, pressing the key against the wood. To her relief and astonishment, the panel shifted with a soft click, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. The air that wafted out was cold and musty, carrying whispers she couldn't decipher. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The passage was cramped and winding, lined with stones slick from moisture. Somewhere deeper within the mansion, the guardians prowled, but Caroline now had a path forward, a chance to uncover secrets that had eluded every other guest. She realized that this journey was far from over. It was only beginning. The passageway Caroline entered was suffocatingly narrow, forcing her to move in a slow, deliberate crawl. Each step echoed unnaturally, bouncing off stone walls that seemed impossibly thick. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Shadows clung to every corner, and she felt the presence of something watching, silent, patient, and waiting for a misstep. Her hands grazed the cold stone walls, following the contours mapped in the journals, leading her ever deeper into the mansion's bowels. After several tense minutes, the passage opened into a small chamber. The room was circular, its ceiling lost in darkness, and the floor was covered in a mosaic of symbols, faded but still discernible. The patterns were intricate, almost hypnotic, and Caroline instinctively felt the pull of their design, as if the mansion itself was beckoning her to step into the center. Her fingers traced the edges of the symbols, and she realized they were more than decorative. They were a puzzle, a mechanism, perhaps a trap. One wrong step, one misjudged movement, and the mansion could very well claim her life, just as it had claimed those before her. Caroline examined the floor carefully, noting that some tiles were raised slightly, while others were recessed. She tested a few with a light tap of her foot. One sank beneath her weight, triggering a soft click that echoed through the chamber. Immediately, she heard the faint grinding of stone against stone, and the walls seemed to shift imperceptibly. She froze, realizing that the room was alive, responding to her actions. The journals had warned her about these mechanisms, but now she faced them directly, feeling the full weight of the mansion's intelligence. She studied the symbols more closely. There was a pattern, a sequence suggested by the markings, but it was subtle, hidden in the alignment of the tiles and the angles of the lines. Taking a deep breath, she carefully stepped on a series of tiles she believed were correct. The chamber responded with a low rumble, and for a moment, Caroline's heart leapt with hope, thinking she had succeeded. Then the air shifted, colder now, and an unearthly whisper filled the room, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking to her. Caroline's pulse quickened, but she pushed forward. The whispering seemed to form words she couldn't understand, a language older than anything she had encountered. Still, she felt the underlying meaning clearly. The mansion demanded respect, precision, and courage. It was not enough to be brave. One had to be clever, observant, and unflinching in the face of fear. She adjusted her steps, following the pattern she deciphered, listening intently to the mansion's subtle responses. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the sequence was complete. A section of the far wall slid open silently, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. The air that emanated from the opening was colder, sharper, tinged with something metallic and unmistakably dangerous. Caroline could feel the tension of the mansion tightening around her, a warning that the challenges ahead would escalate. The journals had mentioned rooms like this, chambers designed to test intellect and resolve, ones that often separated those who survived from those who did not. As she stepped through the opening, the corridor stretched before her, dimly lit by a faint green luminescence that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. The walls were lined with niches, each holding an object: a cracked mirror, a tarnished candlestick, a fragment of porcelain. Caroline sensed that each item had a story, a memory left behind by a past guest, perhaps a warning or a clue. Her fingers brushed a mirror, and she nearly recoiled as the reflection that stared back was not entirely her own. Shadows of someone or something loomed behind her, and she had to remind herself to breathe. The corridor twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine underworld. The key she carried seemed to vibrate softly, as if sensing the proximity of its destination. Caroline's thoughts raced. The mansion was a puzzle, a predator, a tomb, and yet she could feel its design, its rhythm, its intelligence guiding her forward. She had survived the initial tests, deciphered the first sequence, but she knew instinctively that the most dangerous trials were still ahead. A sudden metallic clang echoed from deeper within the passage, followed by a low guttural sound that made her blood run cold. She realized the mansion was no longer merely testing her intellect, it was testing her fear. She pressed on, determined to reach the chamber the journals had hinted at, understanding fully that the Holloway mansion did not merely kill, it measured, it calculated, and it would not be satisfied until it had claimed what it deemed its due. Caroline's steps echoed faintly as she entered a larger chamber, the walls lined with dark, polished wood that seemed to absorb every sound. The air was colder here, sharper, and she could almost taste iron. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something unsettling. The room wasn't empty. A figure stood motionless in the far corner, tall and rigid, its features obscured by shadows. Caroline froze, her heart hammering. The journals had hinted at guardians, spectral or otherwise, left to ensure that no guest ever left the Holloway mansion alive. The figure moved then, impossibly fast, gliding rather than walking. Caroline stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the sweep of a hand that seemed to pass through the air like a blade. The guardian was not human, at least not entirely, its movements unnatural, precise, almost mechanical. It was as if the mansion had crafted this being from its own malevolent will, a sentinel of stone and shadow tasked with punishing intruders. Caroline's mind raced. She needed a plan, a strategy, something to outwit a force that clearly exceeded human strength. She remembered the journals, the detailed notes left by previous guests, and the warnings about the guardian's weakness. They were attuned to light, to sound, to intention. Caroline scanned the chamber, noting a tall candelabrum in the corner, candles melted but still usable. She grabbed one, striking a match she had kept hidden in her pocket. The flame flickered, throwing shadows across the room, and the guardian hissed, recoiling slightly as if the light burned it. Caroline's pulse quickened. Light could repel it, at least momentarily. The guardian advanced, silent now, its eyes, or what she assumed were eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light. Caroline moved toward a small alcove on the opposite wall, the flickering candle illuminating the symbols etched into the stone. They resembled the patterns from the floor in the previous chamber, a sequence meant to manipulate the guardian's movements. She traced the symbols quickly with her fingers, hoping the sequence was correct, praying she had deciphered the mansion's hidden logic. The guardian lunged suddenly, and Caroline's instincts kicked in. She dodged, narrowly avoiding the cold sweep of its arm, and thrust the candle toward one of the etched symbols. The guardian shrieked, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones, and recoiled once more. Caroline realized the room itself was interactive, the symbols were a control mechanism, and she could manipulate the guardian's path by activating them in the correct order. Her fingers moved rapidly, tapping, pressing, tracing, while her eyes never left the advancing sentinel. Sweat ran down her temples, but Caroline's mind was sharper than ever. Each movement of the guardian was predictable once she understood the pattern, a rhythm dictated by the mansion's own twisted logic. Step, lunge, recoil. Step, lunge, recoil. She began to anticipate its attacks, countering with candlelight and careful manipulation of the symbols. The room trembled slightly with each interaction, as though the mansion itself approved or disapproved of her progress. Minutes felt like hours as she danced the lethal game. A misstep would surely mean death, but Caroline held her focus, her breath steady despite the fear gnawing at her chest. The guardian's movements began to slow, its strikes less precise, as though her understanding of the chamber disrupted its connection to the mansion's will. Caroline seized the opportunity, striking the final symbol in the sequence. The guardian froze, then dissipated into a cloud of black mist, vanishing into the shadows from which it had emerged. Caroline sank to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. She had survived the first guardian, proving to the mansion that she was more than a passive victim. Yet, as she looked around the chamber, she noticed subtle changes. The walls seemed to shift, revealing a narrow doorway she hadn't seen before. The mansion was not done testing her. The path ahead would be even more treacherous, filled with traps, puzzles, and guardians more cunning than the first. She rose, gathering the candle, her resolve hardened. Caroline understood one undeniable truth. In the Holloway mansion, survival was not guaranteed by strength alone. Intelligence, patience, courage, and the ability to decipher the mansion's cruel logic were her only weapons. As she stepped through the newly revealed doorway, she felt the mansion pulse around her, a living entity aware of her every move, calculating her worth, and ready to challenge her again. The doorway led Caroline into a long corridor, dimly lit, and lined with mirrors that reflected her every movement. At first, she thought the mirrors were harmless, but as she walked, her reflection began to shift independently, moving in ways she wasn't. Her own image grinned when she felt fear, trembled when she tried to steady herself, and sometimes even reached out toward her as if trying to escape from the glass. Caroline's heart pounded. The mansion had moved beyond physical threats, now it was attacking her mind. Each step became a test. The mirrors distorted reality, creating hallways that twisted impossibly, ceilings that stretched, and floors that seemed to ripple beneath her feet. Caroline clutched the candle, its weak flame a fragile anchor to the real world, and reminded herself of the journal's advice. The mansion preyed on memories and emotions, using them to disorient and paralyze intruders. She had to remain grounded in her own identity, but even that proved difficult. Whispers filled the air, faint at first, then growing louder, voices she recognized. Her own voice, her mother's, strangers she had never met. They taunted her, recounting regrets and secrets, dredging up memories she had tried to bury. Caroline stumbled, nearly dropping the candle, as one reflection lunged from the glass, screaming her name. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to take slow, controlled breaths. Panic was the mansion's weapon. Clarity was hers. She focused on the physical sensations of her body, grounding herself in the warmth of the candle, the pressure of her feet on the floor, the chill of the air on her skin. The reflections screeched and contorted, but slowly she regained control. The corridor ended abruptly at a massive, arched window, rain lashing against the glass, distorting the world outside. Beyond it, she saw the twisted outlines of trees in the Holloway estate's overgrown gardens, and somewhere in that distance, she thought she saw the shadow of another guardian moving silently. The mansion's psychological trials were not isolated, they were layered, a relentless combination of fear, memory, and manipulation. Caroline realized that leaving one trial behind only meant entering another, possibly more dangerous than the last. On the floor near the window lay a scattered collection of objects: a cracked locket, a diary with torn pages, a rusted key. Each seemed mundane, yet Caroline instinctively knew they were part of the mansion's test. She picked up the diary, skimming the entries. They were confessions, scribbled in desperate handwriting, each one recounting a personal failing or a fear realized. One line made her gasp. "The mansion does not kill us for our sins, it kills us for our hesitation." Caroline understood. Indecision, fear, or doubt could be fatal. Every action she took had consequences, and the mansion observed, catalogued, and punished mistakes. She pocketed the locket and key, glancing back at the mirrors. Her reflection was calmer now, but still watched, waiting for a slip. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and the candle flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to dance independently of her movements. Caroline forced herself to take a single step forward, then another, testing the boundaries of the corridor. Each step brought a new memory, a new fear, a new hallucination. Some were vivid flashes of childhood trauma, others were abstract distortions, shapes and faces that morphed impossibly. Caroline's mind ached, but she pressed on, understanding that the only escape was through endurance, focus, and sheer mental resilience. The final stretch of the corridor opened into a vast hall, dimly illuminated by chandeliers with burnt-out candles. The mirrors ceased, but the sense of being watched intensified. Caroline realized the mansion was not only testing her memory and fear but also her willpower. She had survived physical threats, outwitted guardians, and now faced an invisible opponent. Herself, distorted and challenged, forced to confront every secret, every hesitation, and every fear she had ever known. As Caroline stepped into the hall, her determination crystallized. She would not falter. The Holloway mansion could manipulate her mind, frighten her, and twist reality itself, but she would endure. Every step forward, every careful decision, was a victory, a defiance of the mansion's relentless cruelty. Ahead lay trials that would demand more than courage, they would demand the essence of who she was, the very core of her humanity. Caroline stepped into the hall and noticed a narrow staircase tucked behind a crumbling tapestry. The air smelled of old paper and mildew, a scent that seemed almost alive with the mansion's memories. The staircase led down into darkness, but a faint glow beckoned her. She descended cautiously, the wooden steps creaking under her weight, echoing through the empty corridors like distant whispers of warning. At the bottom, she found herself in a vast library, its walls lined with towering shelves filled with ancient, leather-bound books. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the eerie glow of phosphorescent moss creeping along the stone floor and walls. As Caroline approached the shelves, she realized the books were not just ordinary records. They were meticulous chronicles of every guest who had ever entered the Holloway mansion. Names, dates, and times of arrival were followed by detailed accounts of their fears, weaknesses, and eventual fates. The entries were both scholarly and sinister, written in a style that combined meticulous observation with a horrifying delight in human suffering. Some books even contained illustrations of the mansion's twisted corridors, drawn in a way that seemed to shift each time the pages were turned. Caroline picked up a book at random. The first entry described a merchant who had visited in the late 1800s. He had been lured by promises of wealth and indulgence, only to vanish without a trace. The account was chillingly precise. Every misstep, every hesitation, every glance at a mirror or candle was noted, as though the mansion itself had been observing him minute by minute. Caroline's pulse quickened as she read on. The mansion's ability to manipulate reality and human perception was far more systematic and premeditated than she had imagined. It was not merely haunted, it was sentient, a predator cataloging every aspect of its prey. She moved deeper into the library, noticing a desk at the far end, covered with scattered papers and a single open journal. The handwriting was elegant yet frantic, a stark contrast that suggested desperation beneath scholarly discipline. As she read, Caroline discovered the Holloway family's obsession with mortality and control. The journal detailed experiments in fear, isolation, and psychological torment, describing how the family had deliberately constructed the mansion as both a labyrinth and a laboratory. The mansion's architecture, the mirrors, the shifting corridors, and the guardians had all been designed to manipulate visitors into exposing their deepest vulnerabilities. Caroline shivered. The mansion was a carefully orchestrated machine of terror, and every guest was a participant in its cruel experiment. One passage stood out. The mansion is patient. It waits for hesitation, for doubt, for the flicker of fear. Once the mind wavers, the body follows. Caroline felt the truth of these words in her chest. The trials she had endured were only the beginning. The library seemed alive, the books whispering as she moved past them, as if trying to impart a warning she might not yet be ready to understand. She realized that knowledge was her weapon here. Understanding the mansion's history and patterns might be the only way to survive its next onslaught. Suddenly, a faint scratching noise echoed from the far corner of the library. Caroline froze, her candle trembling in her hand. Shadows shifted unnaturally among the shelves, and the phosphorescent moss flickered as though frightened by an unseen presence. Then she saw it. A figure, barely more than a silhouette, skimming along the floor, moving too quickly and fluidly for a human. The journal had mentioned manifestations, shadows of those who had perished, bound to the mansion in eternal torment. Caroline realized the figure was one of them, a ghostly echo, and that the library was not just a place of knowledge but also a trap. Clutching the journal to her chest, she backed away slowly, careful not to startle the apparition. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the journal's warnings resonated in her mind. Hesitation could be fatal. She needed a plan, a strategy, a way to navigate both the mansion's physical threats and its psychological games. Every discovery brought clarity, but also dread. The Holloway family's legacy was a terrifying combination of intellect and cruelty, and Caroline understood that she was only just beginning to comprehend the depth of their malice. As she turned toward another passageway, the shadows seemed to recede, but the weight of the knowledge she had gained pressed down on her. The mansion was not merely a house, it was a living, calculating force. Caroline's resolve hardened. She would use what she had learned in the library to anticipate the mansion's traps, to outthink the guardians, and to survive. But deep down, she knew that the trials ahead would test her in ways no journal could prepare her for. Caroline crept through the dim corridor, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. Every footstep echoed unnaturally, as if the mansion itself was amplifying her presence. The walls seemed to pulse slightly, and the faint hum she had begun to notice since entering the library grew louder, a rhythmic vibration that resonated with her heartbeat. She had thought she understood the mansion's patterns, but a sense of unpredictability chilled her. This was no longer merely a house. It was an intelligent predator, responding to her movements, anticipating her fears. A sudden cold swept across the hallway, extinguishing the small candle she had lit. Caroline froze, her breath visible in the icy air. The journal offered no warning of this particular anomaly. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor, coalescing into a form that seemed to shift and ripple, like water caught in a storm. Caroline's pulse quickened. The manifestations she had read about in the library were not merely echoes. They could interact, influence, even trap those who underestimated them. The figure advanced slowly, gliding rather than walking, its edges shimmering unnaturally. Caroline recognized the description from the journal. The Holloway family had recorded this entity as the Witness, a being that preyed on a visitor's memories and fears. Legends among the family's private accounts suggested that once the Witness fixated on its target, it would replay their most painful moments until the mind broke, leaving the body an empty vessel. Caroline's throat tightened, but she forced herself to remember the journal's advice. Clarity and strategy were her only weapons. She focused, recalling the passages that suggested these manifestations could be manipulated. Their attention could be diverted, their influence diluted by distraction and movement. Caroline began walking backwards slowly, maintaining eye contact with the shifting figure while scanning the corridor for a potential escape route. The mansion responded instantly, the walls stretching and compressing, narrowing the space and heightening the sense of suffocation. The mansion thrived on her hesitation. Caroline noticed a broken archway leading into another hall, partially hidden by cobwebs. She counted her steps carefully, timing them with the entity's movements. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured. The figure advanced faster now, a ripple of cold and sound emanating from its body, echoing through Caroline's mind with fragmented whispers, memories she had tried to bury. Faces of long-lost friends and moments of shame and regret surged forward, and for a moment, her resolve wavered. But she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to repeat silently, "I control my fear. I control my fear." When she reached the archway, Caroline threw a small stone toward a nearby wall. The sound echoed through the corridor, and the figure's attention diverted momentarily, its form flickering with irritation. Seizing the opportunity, Caroline darted through the passage, her body tense and alert. The corridor twisted, disorienting her sense of direction, but she kept moving, using the journal as both guide and talisman, the knowledge of previous victims' mistakes fueling her determination to avoid the same fate. Suddenly, the floor beneath her groaned, and a section gave way slightly. Caroline stumbled but caught herself just in time, realizing the mansion had adjusted to her escape route. The corridors were no longer static, they were dynamic, responding to her decisions, predicting her survival instincts. The realization was terrifying. The mansion did not just trap its victims physically, it attacked their minds, using fear, memory, and the illusion of choice as weapons. Caroline's thoughts raced as she continued down the winding passage, seeking both a physical exit and a mental foothold. The Witness pursued relentlessly, a living shadow of judgment and fear. But she had learned a critical truth in the library. Understanding the mansion's methods granted her an edge. By predicting its manipulations, by anticipating how it would prey on her emotions, she could regain a measure of control. As the corridor opened into a wide, vaulted room, Caroline paused. Moonlight filtered through shattered windows, illuminating a mosaic of broken mirrors on the floor. The Witness hesitated at the threshold, as though recognizing her awareness. Caroline understood then that the confrontation was not over, it was only beginning. The mansion had tested her endurance, her mind, and her courage. The next encounter would push her limits even further, demanding not just survival, but cunning, resilience, and an unshakable will. Caroline stepped carefully into the mirrored hall, the air thick with the scent of dust and something metallic she couldn't identify. Moonlight streamed through the fractured windows, scattering across the hundreds of broken and warped mirrors that lined the room. Each mirror reflected not only her image, but countless variations of it, some pale and terrified, others twisted with rage, and some that seemed almost lifeless, their eyes hollow. The mansion had created an endless gallery of her possible fates, and Caroline immediately understood that this was another of its cruel games. She would have to distinguish reality from illusion or risk losing herself entirely. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, multiplying in the mirrors until it sounded as though an army of Caroline's doppelgangers were marching alongside her. She remembered the journal's warnings. Mirrors in the Holloway mansion were not passive surfaces. They could manipulate perception, trap consciousness, and even generate false memories. One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and a reflection could reach out and drag her into a phantom existence, leaving only an empty shell behind. She swallowed her fear and forced herself to focus. As she advanced, the reflections began to move independently. One version of herself lifted a hand in warning, another sneered mockingly. Caroline's pulse raced. She had to trust her instincts, to recognize the Caroline that was truly real amidst the sea of illusions. But the mansion sensed her struggle, warping the mirrors further, distorting reality until the very floor beneath her seemed to ripple. The walls appeared to close in, and the echoes of her footsteps merged with whispers that sounded eerily like her own voice. The journal had suggested a tactic: focus on a fixed point to anchor reality. Caroline scanned the room, her eyes finally resting on a shattered window at the far end where the moonlight shone brightest. That would be her anchor. Step by step, she moved toward it, ignoring the distorted images that tried to pull her attention, ignoring the versions of herself that screamed, "Stop! You can't survive!" Her hands shook, but she kept them close to her chest, clutching the journal as a talisman and guide. Suddenly, a reflection stepped forward, not mirroring her movements but advancing independently. It reached for her with impossibly long fingers, and Caroline stumbled backward, almost losing her balance. But then she remembered another detail from the journal. The mansion thrived on fear and hesitation. Acting with decisiveness could disrupt its influence. She took a deep breath, forced herself to meet the reflection's gaze, and shouted, "You do not control me!" The reflection froze, its features distorting violently. The other mirrors flickered as if responding to her declaration, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Caroline pressed on, moving faster now, weaving through the mirrors, following the light that marked her reality. She could hear faint footsteps behind her, the echo of something chasing, but she refused to look back. Every mirror she passed reflected a different horror, scenes from her past, twisted visions of the future, and even versions of herself already broken. Each reflection was a temptation to surrender to fear, but she focused relentlessly on her goal: the shattered window and the faint promise of escape beyond it. The hall seemed endless, stretching farther than should be possible. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, yet Caroline refused to succumb. Each step she took was a battle of perception against the mansion's illusions, and slowly, she began to notice inconsistencies. Shadows lagged behind their sources, reflections flickered before she moved, and the whispers lost clarity. She realized that by asserting her will, she could destabilize the hallucinations, weaken the mansion's psychological grip. Finally, she reached the far end of the hall. The moonlight through the window bathed her in silver, illuminating the warped mirrors one last time. The reflections recoiled, their forms cracking and splintering like glass under pressure. Caroline stumbled through the exit, collapsing onto the cold stone floor beyond the hall, gasping for air. She had survived the mirrored hall, but the mansion had tested her limits and revealed a terrifying truth. Every challenge ahead would be as much a battle of the mind as of the body, and the Holloway mansion would never relent. Caroline rose unsteadily from the stone floor, the chill of the moonlight seeping into her bones. Her legs trembled, but her mind had sharpened. The mirrored hall had been a trial, and she had survived. Ahead, the faint scent of roasted meat and polished wood reached her, a smell so incongruous in the mansion's decay it made her stomach twist with suspicion. She moved cautiously, following the aroma through a narrow corridor lined with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. The air seemed heavier here, as if it carried the weight of centuries of secrets. At the end of the corridor, a grand arched doorway appeared, leading into a dining hall that had been preserved in eerie perfection. Chandeliers, tarnished yet still glittering, hung above a long oak table set for a feast that had never been eaten. Silver candelabras gleamed as if polished daily, and each plate bore intricate etchings of the Holloway family crest. The smell of roasted meat came from nowhere. There was no fireplace, no oven. Yet the aroma persisted, haunting and tantalizing. Caroline's instincts screamed danger, but her curiosity pulled her forward. The table was surrounded by high-backed chairs, their upholstery cracked and worn but strangely inviting. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table and recoiled at a sudden cold sensation, as if invisible eyes were watching. The journal had warned her that the Holloways' dining hall was more than a place for meals. It was a chamber of observation, a trap where guests were made to feel honored and welcome before the mansion claimed them. Caroline realized that every surface, every silver utensil, every flicker of candlelight had been designed to lull intruders into complacency. As she stepped further in, the floorboards creaked beneath her, and she noticed that the chairs were not arranged haphazardly. Each was placed with meticulous precision, as if anticipating the exact position of someone sitting there centuries ago. Her eyes were drawn to a particularly large chair at the head of the table, carved with grotesque faces that seemed to leer at her. She approached it, and in a whispering voice, the room seemed to murmur her name. Goosebumps rose on her arms as she understood the hall's unspoken rule. The mansion demanded acknowledgement. To ignore it was to invite danger. To submit was to risk ensnarement. Caroline's gaze drifted to the other end of the room, where a sideboard held an array of decayed fruit, untouched wine bottles, and crystal goblets. She recognized the intention immediately. The Holloways had mastered the art of temptation. Guests would enter, drawn by the promise of sustenance and luxury, only to fall prey to the mansion's labyrinthine horrors. She touched one of the goblets, and a jolt of cold ran through her fingers. The wine, she realized, was not liquid but a viscous darkness that clung to the crystal, pulsing faintly as if alive. Her attention snapped to movement at the far end of the hall. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, forming shapes that resembled figures seated at the table. Caroline's heart pounded. Each shadow moved subtly, as though anticipating her reactions. She understood, with a sinking certainty, that these were not illusions alone but echoes of those who had been claimed by the mansion, trapped in time, forced to replay the Holloways' sinister rituals eternally. The journal had warned that the head of the table held the greatest danger. With careful steps, Caroline approached the ornate chair. Her reflection flickered in the polished wood of the table. Then, just as her hand hovered above the armrest, the chair shifted slightly, as if aware of her presence. A voice, low and velvety, whispered from nowhere, "Sit, or never leave." Caroline froze, considering her options. To sit was to obey the mansion. To defy its trap was to risk being torn apart by its unseen mechanisms. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. Survival meant control, and she refused to surrender to fear. Slowly, deliberately, she moved past the chair, keeping her eyes on the far doorway that led to what she hoped was freedom. The shadows reacted violently, twisting and contorting, but she pressed onward, stepping lightly yet confidently. As she reached the exit, Caroline realized the mansion had revealed its first layer of cruelty. It did not merely kill. It seduced. It manipulated. It enticed with beauty, luxury, and the illusion of safety. The dining hall had shown her that the Holloway family's power was rooted not in overt violence, but in psychological mastery. She exhaled, the weight of understanding pressing on her, and knew that every step forward would demand not only courage but cunning. The mansion was watching, and she had already drawn its attention. Caroline's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she pressed herself against the far wall of the dining hall, the grotesque shadows writhing behind her like a living curtain. She had seen enough to understand that the Holloways did not simply kill their guests, they orchestrated elaborate psychological traps. Every scent, every flicker of candlelight, every polished surface was a test. And she had passed the first, but she knew instinctively that the mansion had more layers of horror waiting. Her eyes caught a faint seam in the floor, near the base of the sideboard. It was subtle, almost invisible, but something about the way the shadows recoiled around it made her pause. Caroline knelt and ran her fingers along the edge, feeling a slight indentation, a hidden latch. The mansion seemed to exhale, a quiet, chilling sigh that rippled through the air. With trembling fingers, she pressed the latch, and a section of the floor shifted with a grinding creak. Dust filled the air as a narrow passage revealed itself, spiraling downward into darkness. The smell that wafted up was pungent, a mix of mold and decay, stronger than anything she had encountered in the upper floors. Caroline hesitated for a heartbeat, every instinct screaming for her to turn back, but curiosity and survival pushed her forward. She pulled a small candle from her satchel, ignited it, and descended carefully, each step bringing a deeper sense of unease. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the house itself were pressing down upon her. The passage opened into a small chamber, dimly lit by flickering sconces, their flames dancing in an unnatural rhythm. And there, sprawled across the cold stone floor, was a figure. At first, Caroline thought it was a mannequin, an elaborate display meant to terrorize, but the scent told the truth: this guest had never left. The body was partially decomposed, dressed in the fineries of an age long past, its face frozen in an expression of shock and despair. The mansion had not only claimed the life but preserved the terror, an eternal warning to anyone foolish enough to enter. Caroline's stomach churned, but she forced herself to look closer. Around the body, strange symbols had been scratched into the floor, some filled with what appeared to be dried blood. The markings radiated outward in intricate patterns, like a spider web of ritual, each line meticulous, deliberate. She realized that the Holloways had a method, not mere murder, but ritualized entrapment that extended beyond death. Guests became part of the house, absorbed into its architecture of fear. As she studied the room, Caroline noticed the walls were lined with small alcoves, each containing items belonging to past victims' jewelry, letters, trinkets, tokens left behind by those who had walked this path and failed. The mansion did not waste. Everything, even the remnants of life, was absorbed into its grotesque museum of power. Her fingers brushed a folded note near the body, and she carefully unfolded it. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky, but the message was clear. A warning to future visitors, a plea that had gone unheard. Suddenly, the candle flickered violently, and the chamber seemed to shudder. Caroline felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of eyes burning into her from unseen corners. The shadows from the dining hall had followed her, trailing silently down the passage, their forms now merging with the darkness of the chamber. She understood then that this hidden room was not simply a resting place for victims. It was another stage in the mansion's sadistic performance, a place designed to amplify fear before delivering the final blow. Caroline steadied her breath and pressed her back against the wall, forcing herself to focus. She could feel the mansion's anticipation, a living intelligence probing for weakness. Every instinct screamed that movement, even a whisper, could trigger a deadly response. And yet, she had learned something crucial. The Holloways thrived on fear, but courage could bend the mansion's influence. Slowly, deliberately, she began to map the room in her mind, noting the exits, the alcoves, the placement of the corpse, every detail that might aid her escape. At the far end of the chamber, partially hidden by shadow, Caroline spotted a narrow staircase descending further. It seemed almost impossible that anyone could have survived this level before, but the journal had hinted at subterranean routes leading deeper into the mansion, paths known only to the Holloways themselves. With one last glance at the corpse and the messages of failure scattered around it, Caroline made her choice. She would descend. The staircase ended abruptly in a long, narrow corridor that seemed impossibly long for the mansion's layout. Caroline's candle flickered against the walls, revealing peeling wallpaper adorned with grotesque faces that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was thick and cold, carrying whispers that teased the edge of her hearing. She realized the mansion itself was alive in a way she hadn't fully understood: walls that moved, floors that tilted, ceilings that groaned like tortured souls. As she moved cautiously forward, the shadows began to stretch unnaturally, twisting along the walls and ceiling, forming shapes that were vaguely human, vaguely monstrous. They followed her every step, responding to her movements with uncanny precision. Caroline tried to suppress the rising panic, reminding herself that fear was the Holloway's tool, the mansion's way of feeding its own power. Every instinct screamed that this hallway was a trap, designed to test not just courage, but wit. Suddenly, the corridor split into two identical hallways, each lined with the same distorted faces and flickering sconces. Caroline paused, realizing the mansion had created a mirrored labyrinth, one that disoriented and confused its prey. She tried to mark her path with chalk from her satchel, only to find the marks vanished moments later, as if the walls themselves were erasing her attempts to leave a trace. A cold hand seemed to brush her shoulder, though when she spun around, the hallway was empty. The mansion had begun to toy with her, probing her resolve. A sudden sound echoed through the corridor, a faint, childlike laughter that was at once innocent and horrifying. Caroline's pulse quickened. She followed the sound cautiously, reasoning that any noise might indicate a passage or hidden doorway. The laughter led her to a small alcove, where a dusty mirror reflected not just her image, but faint silhouettes behind her, figures of past guests trapped in eternal torment. Their eyes were pleading, accusatory, warning her silently. Caroline's stomach churned, but she pressed onward, understanding that to survive, she would have to navigate the mansion's psychological labyrinth without succumbing to its terror. The hallway suddenly shifted beneath her feet. She stumbled, barely catching herself against the wall, and realized the mansion was no longer a static structure. It was a predator. Floors tilted, walls seemed to narrow, and the candlelight cast shadows that became tangible obstacles. The very architecture seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding, forcing her to move with both caution and speed. Panic rose, but she forced herself to focus on patterns, recalling the symbols she had seen in the hidden chamber. The mansion relied on repetition, ritual, predictability. There had to be a logic beneath the chaos. Caroline paused, closing her eyes and listening. The whispers intensified, forming coherent words, fragments of sentences. Turn. Fail. Join us. Never leave. Her head spun as the voices layered over one another. Yet she concentrated on one thread, the directionality of the sound, which subtly guided her forward. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she had learned that survival depended on calm reasoning. Step by step, she moved through the corridor, carefully noting shifts in shadow and texture. Halfway down the mirrored hallway, a figure appeared, a man in tattered 19th-century clothing, his face pale and eyes hollow. At first, Caroline thought it was another hallucination, but he moved independently, blocking her path. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, voice hollow and echoing. "The house consumes all who enter." Caroline's throat tightened. I have to leave," she said, her voice trembling. The figure pointed to a narrowing passage to her left, then dissolved into shadows, leaving only a faint echo of his warning. She realized the mansion used the echoes of the past, the trapped spirits of victims, to manipulate the living an army of reminders and obstacles. With her pulse racing and every sense alert, Caroline edged toward the left passage. The walls tightened, the ceiling lower, the whispers louder, but she pressed forward, aware that hesitation could be fatal. Every step was a test, every shadow a threat. She knew that deeper in the mansion, the Holloways had cultivated not just fear, but sentience within the very structure, creating a living trap that adapted to each intruder. Caroline had survived thus far by observation, courage, and intuition, but the hardest trials were still ahead. At the end of the passage, she glimpsed a faint glimmer of light, a promise, a hope, or another cruel trick. She took a deep breath and stepped toward it, unaware that the mansion had prepared an entirely new form of horror to confront her, one that combined the spectral remnants of the past with the physical dangers of the present, a test of body, mind, and spirit. Caroline's steps quickened as she approached the faint glimmer of light, hoping it was a way out. But the light revealed not freedom, it revealed the Holloways, Standing in the grand foyer, draped in garments that seemed both antique and spectral, were the family members whose names haunted every whispered rumor of the mansion. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes glimmered with a cold, calculating intelligence. It was as if the mansion had incubated them, preserving them through generations, feeding them on the fear and lives of anyone who dared cross its threshold. The air grew thick and heavy, making each breath a labor. Caroline noticed the subtle movements around the room. Shadows that detached from the walls, curling around the Holloways like loyal pets, responding to their every gesture. The patriarch, a tall man with sharp features and an almost serpentine smile, stepped forward. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and chilling, "to Holloway Manor, where every guest fulfills their destiny." His tone carried a promise and a threat intertwined, the kind that made Caroline's blood run cold. Caroline tried to retreat, but the mansion itself seemed to block her path. The walls shifted imperceptibly, narrowing the foyer, and the floor creaked under invisible weight. The Holloways moved in perfect synchrony, circling her with a predator's grace, their eyes never leaving hers. They spoke in a cadence that was both mesmerizing and menacing, recounting stories of guests who had come before, each ending in tragedy. The mansion had absorbed their fear, making it a tangible force that strengthened the family. "You've done well to survive this long," the matriarch said, her voice silky yet deadly. "Many fail before reaching us. Few have the courage, or the wit, to walk these halls unbroken." She gestured, and a series of spectral images appeared around the room, moments of previous victims, frozen in terror, replaying their last moments as both warning and entertainment. Caroline felt the weight of countless deaths pressing down, each echo a reminder that the Holloways were not merely humans, they were conduits, living vessels of the mansion's malevolent will. The youngest of the family, a girl whose eyes were unsettlingly hollow yet ancient in wisdom, stepped forward. "Do you know why none ever leave?" she asked, tilting her head in curiosity. Caroline shook her head, words caught in her throat. "Because fear is the key, and death is the door," the girl whispered. "The house nurtures it all: pain, terror, despair, and feeds us. You are strong, yet the question is, will you endure what comes next?" Caroline's heart pounded, but a spark of defiance ignited within her. She realized that to survive, she couldn't simply flee, she had to confront not just the Holloways, but the mansion itself. Every shift in floorboard, every flicker of shadow, every echoing whisper was a weapon in the family's arsenal. Yet, she also saw the cracks, the moments when their attention wavered, when the mansion's power hesitated in response to her courage. If she could manipulate those moments, perhaps she could turn the tide. The patriarch's smile widened. "Many have tried to outsmart us. None have succeeded. But perhaps you will be the first." His words were taunting, but Caroline understood they were inviting her to the ultimate test. She needed to combine every observation, every lesson learned in the mansion's labyrinth, to survive. One wrong move, one hesitation, and she would join the countless souls trapped within, another ghostly echo to torment the next visitor. The Holloways began to advance slowly, their presence filling every corner of the room. The air shimmered with unseen energy, and Caroline felt the mansion itself pulse in anticipation. She drew in a shaky breath, steadying herself, knowing that the confrontation had begun not just for survival, but for the chance to unravel the dark legacy that had bound the Holloways to this place for generations. The final showdown was imminent, and the mansion's power was at its zenith, ready to test her limits in ways she had never imagined. Caroline's heart raced as she faced the Holloways. The walls of the mansion groaning as if alive, echoing centuries of trapped screams. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made each breath feel like a battle. Every shadow flickered, not just reflecting the family's movements but twisting with them, a living extension of the mansion's malevolent intent. Caroline realized that the house itself was an accomplice, a sentient predator feeding on fear and anticipation, waiting for her to falter. The patriarch stepped forward, his serpentine smile wider than ever. "You've come far," he said, his voice resonating with unnatural depth. "But every journey ends here. There is no escape." Around him, the rest of the family spread out like a living wall, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The mansion's corridors shifted subtly, closing in, reshaping the space so that any path that once led to freedom now looped back to the foyer. Caroline's mind raced, searching for a pattern, a weakness in the maze of horror that had become her world. Suddenly, the youngest Holloway, the girl with hollow yet ancient eyes, spoke, her voice dripping with curiosity and menace. "Do you understand now? This house is not a home. It's a crucible. Every guest is a fuel, every scream a spark, and every life taken strengthens us, binds us tighter to its walls." She tilted her head, watching Caroline with the patience of a predator studying prey. It was in that moment Caroline saw her opportunity. The girl's fascination with her fear could be exploited. If she could control her own terror, if she could turn it into resolve, maybe she could disrupt the mansion's cycle. Caroline's gaze hardened. She would not let this ancient evil consume her. She focused on her breathing, the rapid pulse in her ears, becoming a rhythm she could control. Slowly she stepped forward, deliberately unafraid, confronting the patriarch directly. "You thrive on fear," she said, her voice steady, "but I am not afraid. You cannot feed on what does not exist." The words felt absurd in the face of centuries of malevolence, yet as she spoke them, a tremor ran through the mansion. The shadows shivered, the walls seemed to hesitate, and the Holloways froze, confused by her defiance. For a fleeting moment, the mansion's pulse faltered, as if uncertain how to respond to courage it had never encountered. Caroline moved deliberately, exploiting the hesitation. She recalled every observation, every secret passage, every shadow's pattern she had noticed during her harrowing journey. One by one, she led the family into a series of traps, reflections, misleading corridors, illusions that forced them to collide with their own spectral manifestations. The mansion resisted, shifting, groaning, but Caroline's focus never wavered. Finally, she reached the heart of the house, the grand ballroom, where the Holloway's presence was strongest. The air shimmered with centuries of accumulated dread, yet Caroline stepped forward, anchoring herself in defiance. She invoked the one truth she had discovered. The mansion's power was not absolute, it relied on the consent of fear. With a shout that echoed through the walls, she rejected it. Light seemed to surge from her being, pushing back against the shadows, scattering the Holloways and forcing the mansion to recoil. Screams echoed, not from her, but from the Holloways as the cycle broke. The walls trembled and cracked, the shadows dissipated, and the mansion itself seemed to wail in agony. Caroline, exhausted but resolute, emerged into the fading daylight as the first free rays of sun pierced the windows. Behind her, the Holloway Manor shuddered one last time before collapsing into ruin, leaving no trace of its spectral inhabitants, no memory of its horrors except in Caroline's own consciousness. As she stood among the remnants, Caroline felt the weight of the centuries lift, replaced by an overwhelming sense of survival and triumph. The mansion's dark legacy had been shattered, but she knew that stories of Holloway Manor would linger, tales of a family who once thrived on fear, of a house that had claimed countless lives, and of one woman's courage that finally ended it. Though shaken, she walked away, determined to carry the story of the Holloways into the world, a warning, a legacy of courage, and proof that even the darkest places can be conquered. The sun rose fully now, bathing the ruins in light. Caroline turned for one last glance at what had been a fortress of terror. Silence reigned where screams once echoed, and in that silence, she understood. The mansion had finally met its match. And though the Holloways were gone, their story would live on not as a tale of fear, but as a testament to the strength of those who refused to be consumed.